بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. In this video, we're going to be looking at two interrelated questions. The first question is, when you're married to a free woman, can you marry a slave girl? And the second one here, is that when you're married to a slave girl, can you marry a free woman afterwards? So as for the first one, when you're married to a free woman and then you choose to marry a slave girl, this is not allowed according to the Hanafi madhab as presented here by Imam Marghinani. As for the second one, where you're married to a slave girl first and then you intend to marry a free woman, that's permissible. The simple answer for that is that there are ahadith that prove this, and these hadiths are mutlaq. Um, they're not subscribed. There's no conditions with them, and also there's a rational reason, which is that when you're marrying a slave or when you're a slave, everything is divided. Everything is half for you in terms of rewards and in terms of punishments. We'll come to that in a moment, inshallah ta'ala. So let's begin from here with Imam Marghinani. He says, وَلَا يَتَزَوَّجُ أَمَةً عَلَى حُرَّةٍ. It's not permitted to marry the slave girl when you're married to a free woman. That's what he says here. What's a proof to this? So he provides a hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, لا تنكح الأمة على الحرة. That one should not marry a slave girl after they are married to a free woman. So this is the hadith that we bring. And then Imam Marghinani also points towards an usuli discussion where he says, وَهُوَ بِإِطْلَاقِهِ حُجَّةٌ عَلَى الشَّافِعِ. This hadith that's been mentioned here is mutlaq. In other words, there is no condition mentioned that it has to be a certain type of arrangement. It's mutlaq. There's no conditions mentioned on this. Because Imam Shafi rahimahullah fi tajwizihi dhalika lil. So he makes an exception. And for him, he says this hadith does not apply to the slave. In other words, a slave, if he was to be married to a free woman, and he can marry a free woman, and then he decides to marry a slave girl, then he says that's fine. So for a slave, he makes an exception. We respond and say, well, the hadith is mutlaq. The hadith is not specifying whether you are a slave or a free man, is mutlaq, and therefore you cannot restrict it. This is how we would respond. So just to go back a second, we should know that nikah al-hurra al-amati jaizun bil-ijma', that marrying a free woman when you're married to a slave woman, that's permissible according to all ulama. That's the next masla we'll cover. أما نكاح الأمة على الحرة, as for the case we're looking at here about marrying a slave girl after you're married to a free woman, فعندنا لا يجوز. We say it's not permitted. والحر والعبد في ذلك سواء. We say whether you're a free man, whether you're a slave, the hukam, the ruling is the same. Imam Shafi permits this for the slave. يجوز للعبد أن يتزوج الأمة على الحرة. That he permits this, that for a slave, he can marry a slave girl after he is married to a free woman. Because his usul, if you remember in the previous masail that we discussed, لأنه لا يلزم تعريض الجزء على الرق كما هو أصله. So he is entirely consistent with his usul, that he does not see in the case of a slave that you are presenting yourself, a part of yourself, to slavery. If you remember, when you marry a slave girl, for example, Imam Shafi'i said that this baby that you will have is a part of you, and that part of you are giving that to slavery. He's saying, well, that's not happening here because you are already a slave. This man who's giving, in this particular case, is already a slave. So Imam Shafi'i allows it. Our response is very, very simple. But before that, let's just look at what Imam Malik, may Allah be pleased with him, says. وَعَلَى مَالِكٍ رضي الله تعالى عنه في تزويجه برضاء الحرة. Imam Malik says, he has a different position, slightly different, and he says, well, as long as your wife is happy, you are entitled to marry the slave girl. يجوز تزوج الأمة على الحرة إذا رضيت الحرة. and he has a narration mentioned from Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib أنه كان يقول لا تنكح الأمة على الحرة إلا أن تشاء الحرة. So he has this narration where the hadith is pretty similar, that one should not marry a slave woman on top of or after being married to a free woman, illa, except that the free woman so desires. But we have our response, and ours is what's mentioned by Muhammad ibn Hassan in his Mabsut, where he says that it's reached us from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hadith we've mentioned here, لا تنكح الأمة على الحرة. One should not marry a slave girl after being married to a free woman. And you also have other narrations, for example, just to give you one more. Ali radiallahu ta'ala who says, وتنكح الحرة على الأمة والحرة الثلثان من القسم وللأمة الثلث. So you find these narrations that point in this direction. You might say فإن قلت ينبغي أن يجوز نكاح الأمة على الحرة لعموم قوله تعالى. So somebody might say, well, there's a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وأحل لكم ما وراء ذلكم, that the Quran is giving umumiyya. It's a general permission that from all the muharramat that we've been discussing, Allah says, well, beyond these you can marry whoever you want. قلت ذلك عام خص منه البعض. When Allah says this, this is an am which has been restricted from a ba'd, from part. Ani, what do we mean by this? خُصَّت مِنْهُ الْمَجُوسِيَّةُ. So we know the Quran, we've been discussing this in the previous masail. For example, the Magians, the Majusiyya, wal-Wathaniyya, the polytheists, wal-jam'i bayna al-mar'ati wa ammatiha, this idea of doing jama' between a woman and her aunties, for example. And so those are where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself has done takhsis. And when people debate with this, they're doing debating with khabari wahid on this particular point. Anyway, so our response is very simple. The Quran is mutlaq, or the hadith is mutlaq here rather, not the Quran, but the hadith is mutlaq here, and you cannot restrict something that is mutlaq, that's without any conditions. And then we also give another reason. ولأن للرق أثرا في تنصيف النعمة على ما نقرره في الطلاق إن شاء الله تعالى. And also there is this idea that being a slave means that everything is halved for you. So when it comes to giving talaq, free woman, she for example, you would give three, but to a slave woman it would be two. If you think about the hudud punishment, it's halved for the slave person. So everything has been halved for the slave person. So this has an impact. It affects, or it is effective, if you like, in bringing down the ni'mah of the free of the slave person with respect to the free person. And also the ulama mentioned other psychological points, which is that a free woman, when she's married to someone and then you bring home a woman who's a slave girl, it kind of like looks really bad for her. It makes her feel less less worthy, if you like. There's this ar, as they mention. Anyway, so this is what the fuqaha mention, and they'll talk about this in Kitab al-Talaq. Kitab al-Talaq is the ishara, what I've mentioned, that when it comes to giving divorce, the slave is two, for the free person it's free, and we'll talk about that when we get there, insha'Allah ta'ala. So then we just talk about this final point here. فيثبت به حل المحلية في حالة الانفراد دون حالة الانضمام. So this is basically saying that if you think about it for a second, if you're a slave and you're married to a free wife or free person before, you cannot marry a slave girl, right? Because of what we mentioned here. And if you're a slave, you have options. You can only marry, if you only marry a free woman, for example, then you can marry another free woman, because everything is divided for you. Remember, we'll come across it shortly, that for a free person you have 4 wives maximum, but for a slave person that's divided and it's halved, so they get 2. Okay, so if they were married to a free woman, they could marry one more free woman if they were a slave. If you're already married to a slave girl, then you can only marry one more slave girl, because of what we've just mentioned. and so there's no combination here. That's why he's mentioning here. ولأن الرق أثرا في تنصيف النعمة على ما نقرر في الطلاق إن شاء الله تعالى فيثبت به حل محلية في حالة الانفراد دون حالة الانضمام. The final mas'ala, the second mas'ala is, well, what about somebody who is married to a slave girl first and then he wants to marry a free woman? We say that's completely fine. ويجوز تزويج الحرة عليها لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وتنكح الحرة على الأمة. So we have a hadith of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, but as always we always rationalize and think about it. ولأنها من محللات. This woman is free, like this woman is completely halal for you. It's عام, as the verse in the Quran says, وَأُحِلَّ لَكُم مَا وَرَاءَ ذَلِكُمْ عَامٌ. So we leave it we leave it general, and there's no need for us to restrict it in any way. And then, unless we have some dalil that points in the opposite direction, and also that a free Muslimah woman is halal for you, for any Muslim. Okay, in all states. Um, so this is permissible, and there is no and also for the free woman there's no division, right? There's no, she has full rights, so there's no munassifun, or there's no division in her case because she's a free woman. So this completely makes sense, and it's completely rational and completely reasonable. Okay, I'll see you soon. Please leave any questions behind if you have any. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.